Yeah, that's right. Parents, teachers, students say it took them by surprise when they got word that these 500 families would be transferred here to their high school to stay overnight.
Well, one thing's for sure, nobody's happy about this, especially the people that had to move into the school gymnasium because their shelter flooded. And some people are worried this could happen again.
There is growing outrage against the city's decision to shelter migrant families at a Brooklyn high school.
It wasn't students in classes, but migrants in the gym, and that did not sit well with parents.
It's inexcusable to do this to the students of New York City high schools.
Mr. Mayor, you knew this was going to happen. Everyone knew this was going to happen.
The protesters said schools shouldn't be used as shelters.
And now, with another storm on the way, they're wondering if the migrants will soon return.
So recently, the city of New York made the controversial decision to move asylum seekers from their shelter, which recently flooded, into a nearby school, which meant that the school couldn't be used for educating the students who were expected to be in their seats the very next day. Parents were pretty upset about the city's decision, but before we get into exactly why the city decided to put people in the school, or if this could become the new normal as far as how the city deals with emergencies involving the asylum crisis, it's important to understand that over 160,000 people have come to New York City seeking shelter, which is unfortunately many more people than the city of New York is able to care for. But believe it or not, the city of New York is mandated by the courts to provide temporary room and board to anyone who asks because of the city's unique right to shelter laws. But the city's completely out of room, and that's why people are now staying in tent-style shelters in a decommissioned airfield in Brooklyn, leaving many to wonder what the city plans to do as thousands more continue arriving every single week to New York City from the southern border who need a place to stay.
These tents, they are giant 7 tents on Floyd Bennett Field, so obviously there is concern about winds. The high winds could damage them. Officials say they didn't anticipate there would be flooding.
So the city has many emergency shelters, but what most people don't know is the Floyd Bennett Field airfield shelter is very different. In fact, when this crisis first began, right here in Midtown, the city rented 2 former luxury hotels, the Roosevelt Hotel and the Row Hotel, which both have over 1,000 rooms. But the city's run out of available buildings to use, so they've had to resort to using tent-style relief centers like the airfield facility that don't use an actual building because there aren't any left. But the controversy surrounding this airfield started before anybody moved in. Look at that, it cost $20 million to rent the place. But almost immediately after it opened, people started criticizing the mayor and the governor for deciding to use the facility because it might be dangerous, and that's for several reasons. First, regulating the temperature in a tent in New York during the wintertime, that's gonna be tough. Second, the property's in a low-lying part of Brooklyn that's prone to flooding. And third, the property is actually owned by the United States government, and it's a historic site. But if you want to hammer in a tent stake into the ground to keep that tent from moving, you're not allowed to do that. It's illegal. It's a historic site. You're not allowed to damage it. And unfortunately, this is why during heavy winds and rain, the place can flood and the tents might blow away. And that's what city leaders thought was going to happen last week, and why they made the decision to move 2,000 people from that shelter into a school.
So far in Brooklyn, wind gusts have gotten up to 45 miles per hour. We're still waiting to hear back from emergency management as to whether these tents were indeed impacted anyway.
I can't believe this place cost $20 million and it can't even be used during normal weather patterns in New York. And unfortunately, local residents of Brooklyn, where the school was located, were surprised to learn that their school was even being considered as the location of an emergency evacuation plan. This has never happened before in New York. But it's estimated that the asylum crisis is going to cost the city billions of dollars, which is why moving people into a school gymnasium was the only option the city had left, and some people are afraid it's going to happen again. So here we are at one of the city's many public schools. It's not the same school mentioned in these news reports, but since the city owns all of these properties, any single one of them could be used for a purpose that best suits the city's needs at any given point in time. For example, this particular building is near the Roosevelt Hotel, and what happens if there's an emergency there? This school may very well be looked at as a temporary facility that the city could use.
It wasn't students in classes, but migrants in the gym today at James Madison High School in Midwood. And that did not sit well with parents who felt the administration put the shelter needs of asylum seekers ahead of the educational needs of kids.
Wow, so apparently the school ended up receiving bomb threats. I'm not really sure what that's going to accomplish other than keeping it closed. But at issue here are the city's right to shelter rules, which again provide care for anyone who asks, which legally obligates the city to move people from one facility to another if there's a problem. And in spite of the fact that local parents were upset about this, 80% of New Yorkers overall support the city's right to shelter rules, which means they aren't going away anytime soon. But in spite of the city's overwhelming support for right to shelter, it seems that many families whose kids attended that school were upset that their kids couldn't use the school because other families and their kids were sleeping inside. However, even though city leaders in the asylum crisis are easy targets, that blame may in fact have been premature because apparently the school wasn't completely taken over by asylum seekers who had been moved out before school resumed the very next day. Yes, they were using the school's gymnasium and sleeping on the floor, but they were all out by 4:30 a.m., which means the school was in fact empty when people were deciding whether or not it could be used. But before we dig into this controversy, it's quite an accomplishment that the city was able to move 2,000 people from one location to another and have them out the very next morning. That's pretty impressive. And since the school was in fact empty, this controversy takes an interesting twist because for some reason the people running the school decided still not to use it.
The principal actually decided to do remote learning. Thank you for that. That remote learning is not happening because none of the teachers show up to the link provided.
Interesting. So it sounds like the school's administrators decided to have everyone learn remote, but then it sounds like the teachers who were supposed to show up at those remote learning sessions didn't do so and school still didn't happen. Which means that even though the school was empty and remote learning exists, nobody learned anything that day. Now obviously the school probably had to be cleaned and made ready for people to use, but the asylum seekers were just inside the gymnasium. They probably used the restroom facilities, but you could have closed the gym and cleaned the bathrooms and had the place open and ready to go. That probably wouldn't have taken all day. And critics say this is an example of the city making a bad situation worse because had the school opened as it was supposed to, even if the gym was closed, this would have been a logistical victory. But unfortunately for the asylum seekers, tent shelters and schools aren't the only places they're being kicked out of. Now the city's controversially kicking them out of the luxury hotels as well. So here we are at the Roosevelt Hotel, a former luxury hotel with over 1,000 rooms that the city has been using as an emergency shelter for over a year. But unfortunately, even though this is a much nicer place to stay than a tent in an airfield, people are being told they can't stay at places like this much longer either.
A different kind of movement. The migrant crisis taking a toll in Midtown Manhattan. Dozens of families forced out of their hotel shelter, reaching the 60-day limit now imposed on their stay. Another mess.
Now, we've already mentioned how the city has more asylum seekers than it's able to care for, and what most people don't know is that even though 160,000 folks have come to the city seeking asylum, 70,000 people are still in the city's care and are staying in places like this, which are now reserved exclusively for families with kids. Back in September, the city started evicting adults after 30 days from shelters, and controversially, families were told they would have to vacate after 60 days, and we're about 60 days past when that order was given. Which means families and their kids have to move out of hotels like the Roosevelt and Row Hotel. And not only is this controversial because those families have no idea where they'll wind up next, it's also controversial because even after the city moves someone out of a shelter like this one, they're still allowed to reapply and get replaced in a similar shelter or possibly the airfield shelter because the right to shelter still exists. And many people, including city officials, are upset about how that reapplication process is now being handled. And some people say what the city's doing is wrong.
It's difficult, but we have to move forward, and we give thanks to God and the Row Hotel for taking us in. Garcia walked to the Roosevelt Hotel to reapply for shelter, but not everyone.
So the way it works now is that if you're a family and you have to reapply for shelter, you do it here at this same facility that families live in. But if you're a single adult, you have to go down to the St. Bridget Academy in the East Village and wait in line, sometimes for several days, to wait until a shelter bed is available. But it doesn't appear that there's much of a line here today at the Roosevelt Hotel, which might mean the city is using more resources to help families get a new place than their single adult counterparts. But look, it's freezing out right now. Little kids in the cold, nobody wants to see that. But some people are afraid that's about to start happening.
Running out of space, we're running out of personnel, and we certainly are running out of funds. And so we really have to move from an emergency to managing this in the way that makes sense.
I think this is one of the cruelest policies to come from City Hall in generations, to evict families from shelter in the middle of winter.
So before we get into why the city's comptroller is investigating the eviction process at buildings like this, it's important to understand that the city is basically between a rock and a hard place on this issue. There's no more room, which is why people are being evicted, but the city has a theory about why this controversial policy is helpful, which we're going to dig into. But even though nobody wants to get kicked out of their home, it sounds like the city also has a plan to minimize disruption. Because just as many families here in New York have kids in school, so do families that are here seeking asylum, and the city wants to make sure that even if they transition people from this location to another, it doesn't screw up the kids who are in school. And since it's the city's goal to keep people in classrooms instead of out on the street, the city is likely going to attempt to replace people in locations that are similar to where they've already been staying. But the city's comptroller doesn't really think that's a plausible scenario, and he's decided to launch an investigation.
We today are launching an investigation into the implementation of this 60-day shelter limit.
And that's because it doesn't seem logistically possible to remove people entirely from where they're living, to then give their hotel room to somebody else and expect that there's going to be another room in the exact same place that's not going to cause any disruptions that they can then move back into. And the hard reality here is that the city is unable to guarantee 100% of the people who move out of a place like this similar accommodations. Now, people have already started moving out of the Row Hotel. People fear this hotel's next. And this is an image of a baby's crib in a tent-style shelter setting out on that airfield that flooded, which probably means some people are going to end up in a place like this. In fact, some of the families who are staying at that airfield say that their kids go to school near the Roosevelt Hotel, which is over an hour and a half away and requires transit by several buses to get from point A to point B. There's no way small kids who are in America for the first time, may not speak the language, can safely make a journey like that and be expected to do well in a classroom. And now that the city's running out of money, more and more families could be faced with that awful scenario. And right now, if you're a family staying in a facility like this and it's time for you to move out, sadly, on move-out day, you've got no idea where the bus parked in front of the Roosevelt Hotel is going to bring you. Best case scenario, you don't get on the bus. You go back upstairs to another room. But the worst case scenario is that you get on the bus and go to one of the tent-style shelters that are very dangerous and might require you to move out if the wind is too extreme. And the reason that's a problem is because the city's told asylum seekers in the past that if they reject the shelter option given, that they're essentially rejecting the city's offer of shelter, and now they have to start the reapplication process all over again.
We're launching that investigation today.
And the investigation would hopefully just give you access to the information, but you can't stop it from happening.
Well, we're trying to keep stopping it from happening. That's why we rallied yesterday.
So the comptroller isn't the mayor, and it remains to be seen what the results, if any, will be of his investigation, other than bringing awareness to the fact that this is a terrible situation with no good options on the table for anybody involved. But the mayor's supporters say there's nothing to investigate, because the city isn't kicking people out of these hotels for the fun of it. Instead, thousands more people are arriving by bus and by train every single week. And since everybody arriving is going to need a place to stay, but a place to stay for everybody's not available, the city has a policy that essentially means people have to take turns. And since the availability at each shelter changes on a week-by-week basis, it may not be possible to inform people days or even weeks ahead of time where their next placement might be so that they can plan accordingly. But the reason for this investigation is that new data's come out showing that families who were placed in tent shelters instead of hotels are in for a disaster. People are getting sick because these tents are in the middle of nowhere. Transportation's horrible because there's no subways. It's all unreliable bus service. And this article tells the story of one family who says that their kids try to go to school, but since the buses are never on time, even though they wake up early and they're ready to go to school, no one is available to take them there. And the city has a contract for $600,000 a year to provide bus transit from that airfield to a nearby subway. Isn't that crazy?
They're just starting this at the Row Hotel today. One of the questions we want to know is how rapidly are they expanding it to other shelters, and if it's a terrible failure because kids are being displaced from their schools.
So we're still in the early stages of this eviction process, but the comptroller's afraid that even though only one hotel now, the Row Hotel, is experiencing evictions, that they're coming to this facility next because it's down the street and it's the same type of place. But it's unclear exactly how evictions from this hotel would work. And that's because this is also the location where people have to reapply for shelter after their time is up. And that's got people asking, is the city gonna move families from this building downstairs to a bus and then take them to the airfield shelter and move new families in? Are they gonna let people stay here forever? We don't know the answers to that just yet. But we do know the city's shocking reason for moving people out, and it's because the city claims that over half the people who vacate never end up coming back to reapply.
Criticism is probably equal to any type of athlete. You're in the bleachers. Come in on the field. I'm on the field. And I know that 50% of those who have come to the city, over 50%, we have been able to self-sustain. We first did single adults with a 30-day limit.
So that's an astounding statistic, and I haven't been able to figure out how exactly it works, because if people have nothing and they need a place to stay and then they leave, where exactly are folks ending up? But the city says people are reconnecting with family or friends or are moving on to locations that better fit their needs. And the city says these statistics show why it's helpful for them to have a policy that requires people to move out, because if people never leave the shelters, they may permanently end up depending on them. And that's not the purpose of an emergency shelter, to be a permanent place of residence, especially in the case of a family with young kids. Now, luckily, there are families who've been able to move out of the shelter systems after they've been able to start working and being able to earn a living. But that takes a long time, and the family mentioned in this article, it took them 1 year to save up enough money to get an apartment in Newark, which is in New Jersey, not New York City. And that might be partially possible because the federal government has extended temporary protected status to people from Venezuela, which means they can get work authorization sooner. Normally, work authorization in America requires a 6-month wait, and that is a federal law. But for now, it seems like those who have the ability to work and earn a living in the United States have the best chance of getting out of the city's shelter system. Because if you can't work and support yourself, it's going to be up to somebody else to do that for you. Otherwise, you'll be in the city's shelters forever.
We have been humane, led from the front, but you don't want a child to have a permanent shelter residency. That is unacceptable, and we're not going to tolerate that.
And many folks agree with the mayor. Kids shouldn't have a permanent place of residence in a shelter. That's not a good situation. And the mayor says that the point of a shelter is to transition people from a temporary living situation to a permanent residence in an actual apartment. And while the city struggles with this new plan to evict people who've been living in shelters for 60 days and have kids, the mayor's done his best to assure New Yorkers that nobody's going to be living on the street. And if the city does end up running out of room for shelters, they could fall back on temporary relief centers like the ones in that airfield, at least until enough room frees up to properly move people to a more suitable location. Do you think it was wrong for the city to use a school as an emergency shelter? Is the mayor doing the best he can? Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.